Welcome to this discussion today on some of the more important or critical factors with respect to skeletal and more broadly skeletal muscular health, as the two are tied closely together. My name is John Bagnulo. I am a researcher, longtime educator with respect to nutrition, and I serve as the director of nutrition and research and development for nutritional medicinals. So I want to put that, out there right from the beginning. Nutritional medicinals is the company name for the brand Functional Formularies, who makes a variety of whole food, plant-based enteral formulas. And this topic today, critical nutrients and critical components to skeletal muscular health, is one that is continuously evolving. Certainly has evolved in a very dramatic fashion since my first days of graduate school. I think we're gaining, greater and greater insight into the complexity of bone health, bone formation, what we can do over the course of the lifespan to offset bone loss, which we know is an epidemic globally. With that being said, I'll do my best here in the next hour to succinctly and as articulately as possible identify some of the core components to bone preservation, bone building. And I have, for our conversation today, I have, 4 primary learning objectives. The first is really to help you identify those vitamins whose either dietary intake levels or physiological levels, however measured through serum or other biomarkers, might predict bone health and overall bone mineralization. The second learning objective is I'd like participants to be able to list those minerals that play critical roles in bone development and maintenance, therefore to prevent bone loss. I also want everyone to have a really clear understanding of the potential renal acid load, abbreviated PRAL. How is that determined, and how does the potential renal acid load, how does that influence bone mineralization? And then most importantly, because this is the application component of this topic, what foods and specific types of foods are associated with lower risk of osteoporotic fractures and osteoporosis overall. So those are, 4 big goals. It really, I think, would summarize what's most important. But before we dive into those, I think it's also very important that I try to refresh everyone's understanding of normal bone remodeling, as it's called. The maintenance of bone over the course of the lifespan starts with after normal bone development, which we know, is sometimes limited due to pediatric health issues, lack of vitamin D or sunlight, for instance, inadequate protein in the diet, those things. But assuming that we have normal bone development, after maturity, bone is constantly remodeled. And the remodeling process is governed by, to put it as simply as possible, the role of 2 osteocytes, or 2 types of bone cells: osteoclasts, which ultimately chew into the surface of the bone and free up minerals, primarily calcium, into the bloodstream, that can be used, physiologically across all of our systems, all of our organ systems, and for maintaining normal blood pH of 7.39. We have a really close window of physiologically acceptable pH ranges for our health and for function. Also, minerals are needed for a variety of other things, such as muscle contraction, right? Normal cardiac function. So we constantly have this remodeling taking place depending on the stimuli or the conditions that we're in, both dietarily, environmentally, the amount of physical activity, obviously our endocrine systems and what's going on there with hormone levels such as estrogen. All of this creates an input to the bone cells, and ultimately upstream from that into when these bone cells are essentially stem cells, how they're differentiated in terms of what's needed for bone maintenance. So those osteoclasts, which you see here on this slide on the top left, they look like little goblins, with their teeth chewing into the surface of the cell. That they're going to put calcium and other minerals into circulation at the sacrifice of bone mineralization. So we call that increased bone resorption. Then the other side of things is when you have osteoblasts, which are the cells here with, you can see the small blue nuclei. Those are going to take minerals out of the bloodstream and increase the mineralization of bone. So in normal conditions, we have both processes taking place, creating what we call homeostasis, right? Maintaining normal bone structure and normal bone density. Osteoblasts also have their list of known, what we call osteoanabolic, or those stimuli which will help build bone and increase osteoblast activity. And this is really, I guess, in summary. There are others, but these are the ones with various levels of clinical, I guess you'd say, clinical strength, supporting their roles in osteoblast versus osteoclast activity. Obviously the stress we place on bones is huge. And even though much of this conversation, and certainly much of my work as a researcher and educator revolves around nutrition, I would be remiss if I didn't say that this might be at the very top of the list. The stress that we place on our bones may be the single most important factor in this conversation. And although we may have, again, a pandemic globally of vitamin D deficiencies, regardless of where populations live, people are spending less and less time outdoors. Despite that, despite all of the imbalances that we know occur in most human populations now with respect to nutrient deficiencies across the board, the lack of weight-bearing exercise, a lack of resistance work, resistance training is sometimes I find a little myopic, but just resistance work, placing physical stress on our bones, is at an all-time low over human history. Never before have we been as sedentary as we are now. Never before in human history have we placed less stress on our bones through physical work. If you combine that with all of the other components here, you can see that we're obviously experiencing the perfect storm. So bone stress results from weight-bearing exercise, all of the tiny processes on bones where ligaments and tendons generate stress on the surface of the bone. That type of input is huge with respect to osteoblast activity, stimulating more osteoblasts, cell differentiation when they are stem cells to form more osteoblasts, and the subsequent mineralization that they drive. Those are possibly your number 1A factors. And then obviously vitamin D as a hormone plays a huge role in bone mineralization, as well as, again, osteoblast activity, the potential renal acid load, which we're going to look at here in a moment, having enough dietary protein. And I've given, a variety of talks on this over the years, to different groups, from physicians to college students. And so many people are still under the, this assumption that you want to eat less protein to have stronger bones. And nothing could be further from the truth. We know that inadequate dietary protein almost always results in less than optimal bone mineralization. In many cases, sarcopenia goes hand in hand with osteopenia and osteoporosis. So we have to have enough dietary protein to help build the bone matrix, because bone is a very complex organ. It's not simply made up of minerals. It has a very strong protein core that has to be formed properly before it can be mineralized, and that's where protein intake is critical for the maintenance of that. Then calcium, which is fairly well understood here by most health professionals and the public at large. Estrogen plays a big role in osteoblast activity, And then three that I'm going to spend more time on today that are lesser known are the trace minerals silica and boron, and the fat-soluble vitamin K. With respect to osteoclast activity, those factors that have a huge influence on their activity in their overall role in demineralizing bone are elevated parathyroid hormone levels, or PTH levels, a sedentary lifestyle like we just talked about, a potassium deficiency, which is quite common, vitamin D deficiencies, which we know are rampant, high potential renal acid loads, because often these populations don't have the necessary potassium levels to neutralize the acid load, and then excessive dietary phosphorus and phosphate loads through things such as soft drinks and other foods. So that's a very succinct list of the foods that are known to influence both osteoblast and osteoclast activity. Now, let's start this conversation out with one of the greatest papers I feel ever published in the field of nutrition. And that's a huge statement, but I have very strong convictions around the role of this paper in helping shape the future with respect to how we look at nutrition. Lauren Cordain in 2005 in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition published this landmark paper, which identified a number of changes that have occurred in the human diet over the last several hundred to several thousand years, and how they have really helped shape many of the chronic diseases that we see now in most human populations. And one of those changes is the displacement of, potassium-rich and mineral-rich foods with foods that contain very little in the way of micronutrients, especially in the way of potassium and minerals such as calcium and magnesium. And so displacing vegetables and a variety of greens, green leafy plant foods with grains, sugars, and vegetable oils, if we look at them simply on a caloric level, we've displaced upwards of 75% of what humans would have eaten a few thousand years ago with foods that are relatively new to the human diet. And that has resulted in an unprecedented potential renal acid load. Now, again, this is a fairly complex topic that is taught in the field of nephrology, but outside of that area of medicine, it's less understood. So I want to, with this as a backdrop, I want to explain this dietary acid load, which is, Lauren Cordain is just one of many researchers, investigators that have focused on the potential renal acid load as an explanation for not only bone health or skeletal issues, but a variety of others, such as a loss of muscle mass as we grow older. Some of the research coming out of Tufts University in the last 10 years showing that the higher the grain consumption, the more likely that there'd be osteoporosis in both men and women. Again, not that grains per se are the cause of that, but that grains and cereals and breads and those types of foods, they tend to displace the foods which provide the most robust quantities of things such as potassium and calcium. And this, again, Frassetto and many of Frassetto's papers, really look at dietary acid load and how those affect both skeletal and muscle mass status in older adults. So it's not to say that Lauren Cordain is alone in this. And Mangano, Mangano's papers on this are one of, I would say, the papers that have really given most of the health professionals that are interested in learning more about this the greatest information to work with. And I think this Mangano paper, which is, it's a 2014 paper, so it's over 8 years old now, did a great job in first identifying what this potential renal acid load equation, how it looks, and then looking at the effects of varying potential renal acid loads in different human populations, what was observed. And so, that as a backdrop, I want everyone to understand that the foods which increase the net acid load, they have different coefficient weights, so they have different strengths in terms of how they influence ultimately the pH of our blood. And let me stop there and say that the pH of human blood is 7.39, and it will almost always be 7.39, barring some very, very unique environmental condition typically, such as, someone goes to altitude, you go to 18,000 feet and then you can start to develop some type of metabolic alkalosis because of the respiratory rate that's required at that type of altitude. We know that in extreme conditions, you can have metabolic acidosis, again, due to very unique conditions. But by and large, with an individual that has a normal respiratory rate and has, a typical, just let's say standard American diet, however that might look, you're not going to find this metabolic acidosis or alkalosis because the pH of our blood is tightly regulated by both the renal system and, by today's topic, the skeletal system. When the pH of our blood is presented with some type of net acid load, for this conversation, let's say really a large amount of dietary protein that's of course made up of amino acids. When those amino acids enter the bloodstream, they are very quickly neutralized by either the calcium from our skeletal system, which of course requires those osteoclasts to start to chew into the surface of the bone to liberalize this calcium, to liberate that so that it can be used for the neutralization process. And the kidneys, through the production of the potassium bicarbonate ion, will also generate a buffering activity immediately. So that's why the pH of our blood almost always stays at 7.39. But I think the operative component to this discussion is that pH of 7.39 requires constant buffering activity. And that buffering activity is ultimately what we're talking about here. Are we, at the end of the day, are we experiencing a net loss in bone mineralization? Are we relying very heavily on that and our renal system to constantly neutralize these potential renal acid loads? And again, the protein's a big one. Phosphorus is to a lesser extent, but it's a known acid load. Those are your big, sulfur is to a much, much lesser extent than these two, although it's in some potential renal acid load equations. But for the simplicity here of this conversation, we're only going to discuss these two. Those protein levels and phosphorus levels of our diet, when they enter the bloodstream, and they're important. They're important for healthy bones, so it's not to say we can avoid them. We're going to need adequate amounts of dietary protein to have healthy bones, and we're going to need dietary phosphorus to have healthy bones. So they're required, but they have to be balanced. And I think, that's where the bottom half of this equation, where you see the subtraction or the negative numbers. In this case, negative means a lesser acid load and a more beneficial with respect to bone mineralization effect. You see, potassium is the one that has the highest coefficient in terms of the greatest strength, and that's, it's doubly effective because potassium tends to occur in our diets in much higher levels than the other minerals. Then there's magnesium, which is at a 0.026 coefficient or weight, and calcium, which is at half that, at 0.013. So despite the importance of calcium, and I don't want to underscore its importance for healthy bones, when it comes to the potential renal acid load equation and the ability of minerals to maintain a balance there, potassium is unrivaled. And so that's why I want to make sure we spend a good amount of time understanding and just really helping you understand the role of potassium in bone health, because it's really, bar none, it's the nutrient that we have to really focus on. Okay, so, I said that this is it's a lesser understood equation, this potential renal acid load, and it's also a poorly understood component of bone health, and it's not widely agreed upon. It's somewhat controversial. There are varying strengths of clinical support here when we're talking about this. The Mangano papers, though, as I mentioned a few moments ago, are among a handful which have shown real clear changes, and you'll see that this paper, which looks at the influence of the potential renal acid load, or in this case, this paper refers to the dietary acid load, that you can see with men, in the first quartile who have the lowest acid loads. You can see that their femoral and lumbar spine bone mineral densities were higher than they were in the fourth quartile, which had the highest acid load. Again, but calcium has to be taken into account here, and also the fourth quartile had less calcium. So There's controversy around this concept in determining bone health and bone mineralization because it's very hard to separate some of the components of the acid load equation. I mean, if you're going to say that, you know, that yes, there's a higher acid load in this group of men that had the, you know, the lower bone mineralization scores, you know, equally important is the fact that they had less calcium. So it's very hard to control for some of these components to that equation, despite us having that coefficient that I described earlier. And then you have some of these papers which show the effects to be in one sex, men in this case, versus women, where there were no effects really observed. So there is still some controversy, and it doesn't have the clinical support that we might have for the potassium level of the diet or the calcium level of the diet. And ultimately, there are multi components at work here. So it's, you know, I think that this potential renal acid load is I think it's a very significant part of this discussion. But again, it's made up of several factors: the amount of dietary protein, and the amount of potassium, the amount of calcium, the amount of magnesium in a population's diet. And so because all of those components are at work, you know, it's ultimately going to be a function of all of those different nutrients and the amount of those nutrients provided by a diet, and potentially the bioavailability of those nutrients, which ultimately means how well they can be absorbed. So it's a complex component in terms of what influences bone mineralization. And the reason I say that it's you know, that it's somewhat controversial is because papers such as this Fenton paper, which is a meta-analysis, okay, so it's not a clinically controlled type of investigation, but it's a meta-analysis, and it's now around 11 years old. And what it showed was that the Pearson's correlation coefficient, which really is the slope of this line we're looking at, okay, the strength of relationship between two variables, in this case, looking at the amount of urinary calcium that's excreted in relationship to the net acid load, or the variable that was used in the study is the net acid excretion, because some of that net acid load has to be excreted. Looking at the strength of relationship between those two variables, this meta-analysis showed that when you looked at, you know, 10 papers or more, it's not a strong Pearson's correlation coefficient. It's not an R of 0.75, which is what we get between things such as smoking and lung cancer. It's a lower Pearson's correlation coefficient, regardless of whether you're looking at urinary calcium, urinary potassium excretion, the net acid load, or the net phosphorus load. So again, I think there's more research needed for both a better understanding of the potential renal acid load and ultimately how much it influences bone health, bone mineralization. I think some very important questions have been raised, and I would be inclined to say that this should not be disregarded. This should definitely be looked at by clinicians if they're able to get a picture of what the population that they're working with, what they're consuming in the way of protein, the way of potassium, as well as in terms of the magnesium and calcium content of their diet. I think if you get a really good picture for what those levels are like in any individual or population's diet, you'll be able to get a clear picture for not only the potential renal acid load that they may be consuming and dealing with on a day-to-day basis, but what the levels of those nutrients are like in terms of the bigger picture, bone preservation, bone maintenance, because again, it's all tied together. So that's the potential renal acid load, which again, you got to really focus on having all populations receive adequate protein. And I think that, you know, many of you may have attended a webinar that we offered, you know, a couple months ago on how much protein is actually necessary for optimal health. And I can tell from the emails that I received and some of the feedback from that discussion that people were surprised about the protein recommendations as they related to both skeletal muscular health and skeletal health alone, meaning that, you know, most people are right on the edge of consuming enough protein for optimal skeletal health, and that, 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight is more optimal, especially for an elderly population looking to optimize bone health. But that protein, that has to be balanced with potassium. And we know from the last NHANES study, which is really, the NHANES data is what we use to get most of our information on how adequate dietary levels are, or how frequent deficiencies are in the US population. And from that 2007, 2008 NHANES data, it's apparent that if we look at the, adequate intake recommendations put forth by the Institute of Medicine with respect to potassium, which has historically been 4,300 milligrams for adults, a very, less than half of Americans receive that level of dietary potassium. And, potassium regulation in the body, this is a great paper. This is the GUMS paper on potassium homeostasis as it relates to not just bone health, but cardiovascular health. It's probably the mineral whose dietary intake has the greatest control over cardiovascular health. Most people are unaware of that. And it's, again, this is the mineral that we need the most of in the body on a daily basis. So it makes sense. If it's a mineral that we need the most of physiologically in the body, over 4 grams per day, and you compare that to, 1 gram of calcium per day, 2 grams of sodium per day. It's head and shoulders the mineral that we need the absolute most of for all physiological conditions. Then it's axiomatic to understand that deficiencies, populations receiving less than half of that per day, and believe me, they're out there. Populations that are relying very heavily on processed foods are getting, less than 2,000 milligrams per day, far less. That there are going to be dire consequences for that, really from head to toe over the course of a lifespan and over human physiology, all organ systems included. So, potassium is really front and center in this conversation. And the richest sources of potassium are going to be green leafy vegetables, far and away the best source on a per 100 gram level. You could even say on a per serving size, as well as dairy products, things such as yogurt, milk. They are very high in potassium. Now, once dairy products are separated, once the whey and the casein are separated, most of the potassium goes with the whey. Very little goes with the casein. That's why cheese provides very little in the way of potassium in comparison to full whole food dairy products and whey products. And then, some fruits are good sources of potassium. They're not great in compared to green leafy vegetables. Some nuts and seeds are excellent sources. But really, it's green leafy vegetables and vegetables in general that really need to be a foundation of what we eat on a daily basis. Those plant foods are the primary contributors to the overall potassium intake on a daily basis. So this is a really important concept, how it is minerals support bone health. Now, I'm saying minerals and not trace minerals. And so minerals help preserve and build bone through just a couple different mechanisms. Number one, they can be an integral part of the actual bone matrix, meaning that the calcium, the magnesium, the phosphorus, again, I don't want to paint phosphorus in a negative light here. Those minerals can be part of the actual bone matrix. They can be what is incorporated into the bone to make the bone more mineralized and more dense. That's function number one. Number two, minerals can be part of the bone matrix, an important part of the ladder, so to speak, that all of the other minerals are woven into. And that's certainly the role of magnesium in the role of developing hydroxyapatite or the complete bone matrix. And the third role, which I want everyone to be familiar with, is that minerals can actually buffer out some of the acids and the net acid load or the potential renal acid load that is presented to our physiology through our consumption of certain foods. So the proteins, which are made up of amino acids, the phosphorus in our diet, those components can be buffered by the minerals in our diet. Again, primarily potassium, calcium, and magnesium. So those are important concepts around the mineral content of our diet. Now I'd like to shift into some other micronutrients that play important roles in the osteoblast or osteoclast activity, the communication between certain hormones and those osteocytes. And I'm going to start with one of the two fat-soluble vitamins we'll talk about today, and that's vitamin K2. Now, vitamin K2, again, very different than vitamin K1. Vitamin K2 has to be produced by bacteria. It goes by the name of menaquinone, and there are different types of menaquinone. There's, vitamin K2, MK4, MK7. These are different menaquinones, but they're produced in the fermentation process. And that production of vitamin K2 can happen in products such as yogurt or a fermented vegetable food where the bacteria act on the substrate, in the case of the lactose in the yogurt, some of the proteins in the yogurt, they can certainly act on the lactose that's present, the small amounts that are present in the sauerkraut, kimchi type of fermented vegetables. But fermentation is what produces vitamin K2. It can also be produced by animals that graze on grass. It can be produced by chickens that have access to the proper forage. And these animals can produce vitamin K2, which ultimately end up in the cheese of, let's say, sheep or goats or cows for that matter. The yolk of a chicken egg where the chickens are foraging on certain plants. So vitamin K2 can be produced when we ferment certain foods, and it can be produced by animals that have the proper forage and the right digestive tract to generate menaquinone. And then we consume those animal products, or we consume those fermented foods, and we absorb the vitamin K2. And it has very different physiological roles than vitamin K1, which most people understand vitamin K1 in terms of its role in the clotting cascade and forming clots, prothrombin activity. But vitamin K2 has a much broader physiological role, and especially when it comes into bone formation, bone remodeling. Vitamin K2 at the proper physiological levels, which we'll look at in a moment, it can really block osteoclast activity, and it can favor osteoblast, osteogenesis, creating new bones. So it's important. And, the other interesting part about vitamin K2 is in addition to helping mineralize bones through improved osteoblast activity, it has also been shown to protect soft tissues from what we call pathology in the way of calcification. We don't want soft tissues to be calcified, and we do want our teeth and our bones to be calcified. And vitamin K2 seems to play an important sentinel role in that. This is a great paper by Maineni, which is really looking at the oral health model and the role of vitamin K2 for both dental structure in the jaw, but it all really overlaps with skeletal health. And, if we look at all of the different effects of vitamin K on the broader topic of homeostasis within the bone, we know that it plays a big role in osteoblast function. Like, that's well established. But one thing that I haven't really talked about yet, and I should, is the importance of forming that matrix at the core of bone. A tropocollagen helix is how we often refer to it. That you have to have the proper matrix for bone health, and vitamin K2 is important for that, as is vitamin C. I mean, again, we only have an hour together today, so I really chose the micronutrients that I felt from my interactions with clinicians, from the conversations I've had with different physician groups, and some of the courses I've taught at the university level. These are the micronutrients that I feel are really not well understood. Vitamin C, I think most people understand that vitamin C is very important for bone modeling, bone repair, because of how that tropocollagen helix has to form first before bones can ultimately heal or be repaired. And it's the same with vitamin K2. It's important for that carboxylation, it's a cofactor of carboxylation, which really allows protein matrices to form properly. And it inhibits, as I mentioned earlier, it inhibits excessive bone resorption by the osteoclast. So vitamin K2 can actually induce osteoclast apoptosis, which means the self-destruction of osteoclasts because the conditions warrant so. So that's, again, it's multiple roles for vitamin K2 in overall bone remodeling and bone repair. And what's clear is that most people just don't consume enough vitamin K2. And that brings me to the Rotterdam study, which is published in the Journal of Nutrition in 2004. And it's been discussed heavily, over the last, 18 years in most fields, but certainly in the field of cardiology. What the Rotterdam study showed us initially is that you have far less aortic calcification. I'm not going to go any deeper into it than that, because our focus today is on the process of calcification and where minerals end up. Obviously we want to keep calcium away from the carotid arteries, the coronary arteries, and obviously the aorta. And higher levels of dietary vitamin K2 resulted in significantly less calcification of the aorta, as well as all types of benefits with respect to cardiovascular risks. Now, at first glance, that might not seem to be that significant, but think about this: there's a 50% reduction in the amount of calcium that ends up on arteries, the aorta specifically, when levels of dietary vitamin K2 were greater than 32 micrograms per day. There's no, again, no difference here when you're less than 21 to 21, but you get over 32, and there's a linear relationship here. So, why I'm showing this is it's just really important to understand that vitamin K2 governs where calcium ends and where minerals end up in the body. It keeps it away from soft tissues like our arteries, and it really encourages the deposition of minerals, calcium specifically, on bones and teeth. But the levels of vitamin K2, over the course of the last 50 years, they're almost 60% or less. And if you look at the sources of vitamin K2, and I've got a better illustration of that, you can see that all of your fermented foods, cheeses, egg yolks, those are the richest sources of vitamin K2 by far. But you'll see that an egg yolk from the Netherlands, where the chickens are out on grass more of the year, one egg yolk provides the 32 micrograms per day, which the Rotterdam study showed to be protective. Whereas an egg in the United States, which there's a less chance that the chicken is actually on forage and things that can help drive fermentation in the rumen of the chicken, less than half of that. But that said, it would take 2 egg yolks to provide the 32 micrograms roughly per day. So again, it's it's a function of what people are eating, where some of that food is grown. But fermented foods, both animal and plant foods, are really the primary sources of vitamin K2. And if a population has a deficiency in vitamin K2, which is not something we really screen for, like we do other vitamins, then they're going to be detrimental effects on bone health. So I find that fat-soluble vitamin to be really intriguing, just given where we are in terms of the infancy of understanding the difference between K1 and K2 across the field of medicine here in the United States. And that leads me to the next fat-soluble vitamin, which is vitamin D. This is one that more and more people are becoming just really well-versed in understanding. When I first started teaching at the University of Maine in 1999, there were, I just think, so many unwarranted concerns around very modest doses of vitamin D as a supplement. What we've come to learn since, the 1980s and now, coming to this point here, is that you just don't observe toxicity in human populations, adults that is, with doses less than 30,000 IUs per day, which is shocking for people to hear. And you don't observe toxicity in levels less than 200 nanograms per milliliter of blood. And this is, again, a stark contrast to some of the concerns in the 80s and 90s because of what was observed in places like the UK when a supply of milk was contaminated with vitamin D. It was fortified excessively, was given to kids, and there were some health consequences to that. But those were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of IUs that those kids were getting in a glass of milk. Very different than what we're talking about here. So again, there's really no clinical evidence showing harmful effects at these very high doses. I'm not in any way recommending these doses for adults, in terms of improving bone density. I just want to put this slide out there first to say that when we're talking about vitamin D, whether it's through sun exposure or modest supplementation, if someone doesn't have access or there's no available sunlight, depending on where someone lives, that a couple hundred or a few thousand IUs a day is probably more warranted, than the amounts that are typically provided in things like multivitamins. And so we'll get to that in a moment. But if we look at risk reduction, and this paper by Garland is one that I frequently go to on a variety of topics because it shows the importance of this hormone when we take levels from, what was at one time, we had a serum reference level of 24 nanograms per milliliter. It's been increased, over the last 2 decades to now 32 nanograms per milliliter by most health centers and physician groups. If you take a population, and we're going to focus on fractures all combined, and again, fractures, okay, that's not going to specify whether the fractures are due to osteoporotic processes, but there's you reduce the risk by 25% if you get someone from 24 nanograms per milliliter to 30, if you see here, 38. You go from 38 upwards to 46, and now you've got a 50% reduction in fractures. Now, we have to assume that some of those fractures occurred because the bones were weakened to begin with. But again, this is all we have with respect to risk reduction with serum vitamin D levels as it counts all fractures combined. Now, someone might say, well, what is it that vitamin D does that lends itself to this conversation? Well, first of all, it's a hormone. We have receptors for it in every tissue in the human body, including those osteoblasts, those cells that we've been talking about on the surface of the bone that are really responsible for this osteoanabolic process of increasing bone mineralization. Those cells are highly sensitive to the physiological level of vitamin D that we carry. So that's where the level of vitamin D in our blood is going to have a very profound influence on the activity of those osteoblasts. Now, when the osteoblast is under-stimulated because of low levels of serum vitamin D, then it suppresses the ability or the activity of that cell. I think what's less clear is how much does vitamin D supplementation influence this when it is just being addressed on its own. Again, I'm going to keep going back to that. There is a very complex set of variables at work in the overall picture, or the mosaic, as I like to say, with respect to bone remodeling. You have the net acid load, you have the individual roles of minerals, and we'll get to trace minerals in a moment. You have the formation of the tropocollagen helix, where vitamin C and vitamin K2 come into play, as well as just having adequate amounts of dietary protein, which is necessary to absorb minerals. It's necessary to form that core structure of the bone. So there are a lot of different things going on at any given time that ultimately determine the development of bone and the homeostasis of bone mineralization. Can vitamin D supplementation on its own override significant issues in other areas? My guess is no. That being said, it's an important variable that when we're trying to improve the bone density of a certain individual or a population that we're working with, we have to address it. But I just want to keep coming back to the importance here of synergy and multivariable factors at work. This is not about one particular nutrient or taking a supplement of one identifiable nutrient or factor and expecting to reverse bone loss or improve bone density. I don't believe that. I think that there are instances where one or two pieces of this puzzle are missing, and they have to be addressed to have optimal responses in a person or a patient's bone health. But vitamin D on its own, taken as a supplement, with the presence of, let's just say, mineral deficiencies, a high net acid load, right, inadequate dietary protein, lack of strength training or resistance work, a sedentary lifestyle, I don't think it's going to compensate for all of those. That being said, it is an important factor, and you can see here with this illustration that if you have less than ideal serum vitamin D levels, this is what's been observed in the bone structure of those individuals that have the concurrent vitamin D deficiency, as determined by less than 30 nanograms per milliliter of blood. You're going to have much larger, Habernagen canals. You're going to have, again, you're going to have porosity, which is how we define osteoporosis, and larger, much larger, less developed lacunae or the porous areas in those centers of the bone. So those are the two fat-soluble vitamins that I wanted to cover. Vitamin A is important for many reasons. Again, it's more of a hormone, and it has a huge influence on gene expression, especially gene expression, that relates to bone health. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention vitamin A in this conversation. I really look at all three of those fat-soluble vitamins as being pivotal, not only for bone health, but for, as I've talked about, cardiovascular health and the health of most organ systems. Now, silica or silicon, and specifically orthosilicylic acid, this is a trace mineral that is frequently neglected in our focus on calcium. Our health system really focuses on calcium, now more recently vitamin D, but we really don't talk to patients about the trace minerals like zinc, silica, and we'll get to boron in a moment. But silica also very important for collagen synthesis, very important for that collagen helix, that tropocollagen helix we've been talking about. If you don't have adequate silica, it doesn't form properly. It also helps with osteocalcin levels, which is going to really help with bone mineralization. It also, silica, tends to reduce the surface area with which these osteoclasts can work or can cause bone resorption. So there are multiple, as is the case with most micronutrients, there are multiple factors at work with how this trace mineral helps drive increased osteoblast activity, suppresses osteoclast, bone resorption, and how this really helps us build a healthier core to our bone. Silica, silicon, really whichever way you want to, describe the mineral, it's been really lost in this overall conversation. There are two papers here that I've shared the reference with you, to do a deeper dive into understanding how you might incorporate silica-rich foods into your patient or your population's diet. I'll give you the cliff notes on that now. The richest sources of silica on the planet really come from two different herbs. One's a culinary herb, the other's more medicinal. Parsley is the culinary herb that has the highest silica content, followed closely by cilantro, Brazilian severte. You also have high levels of silica in chives. The medicinal herb with the highest silica content is horsetail. Horsetail is about 90% silica by weight. That's why you'll find that some clinicians recommend horsetail tea, which is a simple horsetail powder mixed with hot water and maybe a small amount of honey as a daily way to increase silica content in a patient's diet. But silica is also found in all of your brassica vegetables, things like kale, collard greens, cabbage, that entire family, Brussels sprouts. They're very, very high in silica. They have a very high affinity for it if it's in the soil, but it does have to be in the soil. If there are limitations to the silica content of the soil, there'll consequently be limitations in what's found in the plant at harvest. So silica is important. It's a trace mineral. We don't have, we don't have DRIs for that. We probably should, especially with respect to bone health, but that's just a crash course on its role. And boron is the other trace mineral that I find very few people understand or know much about. Laura Pizzorno from Bastyr University. I got a lot of respect for Laura and Joe's work there. I have a great paper on boron that I encourage you to read. It's got a good table here, which I've shared, looking at the richest sources of boron. You know, boron is, I guess the best way to describe it, it drives osteoblast activity, and it appears to be, especially with respect to women's health, it appears to be like the communication channel between estrogen and osteoblasts. So osteoblasts become more active with higher levels of estrogen. That, you know, that's well known, and boron probably plays a pivotal role in that. But we actually know less about boron and its role in the stimulation of osteoblast activity. We know that there are higher levels of boron typically in the diets of populations that have higher levels of bone mineralization. We know that it does extracellularly, it does drive osteoblast activity. So some of those things are clearly known, but a more recent discovery is how it interacts with estrogen and helps with osteoblast recruitment from that perspective. Avocados are the greatest source on a per gram level. And then all members of your prunus family, which are things like apricots, almonds, prunes. I mean, it's been shown that eating prunes on a daily basis improves bone density. I mean, that's a fascinating study. I won't digress into that any further, but boron is probably one of the important components to that, those observations. All your nuts and seeds are good, but your prunus family is especially, which are, again, almonds, cherries, apricots, all great sources of boron. And, just for the sake of time here, this is an awesome paper by Rondinelli and other colleagues, investigators, that looked at the different factors here in terms of what influences bone mineral density. And these guys are, this team of investigators have really put out some excellent papers, very kind of broad, whole foods based papers. That's why I like them so much, that look at all the different papers out there. They generally use meta-analyses to evaluate and consider the strength of different papers. But you can see boron only has 2 papers, but they're very significant. Calcium's not on this list because it's so well known. There's several hundred papers. But this team of investigators have come up with their own food guide pyramid as it relates to bone mineralization. There's things about it I really like, and there's some things that I'm a little conflicted about, like high calcium mineral water. That's not going to be available to every population. And I think there might be some other aspects of this that could be tweaked. But that being said, I think it's really good for the most part, really good guidance and encouraging balance, with respect to minerals and protein, and really trying to limit the phosphates and some of those components to our diet. As we run out of time here, and I want to leave at least a couple minutes for questions, I want to give you some clinical recommendations that I think have the greatest efficacy. Number one, start with adequate amounts of protein for the populations you're working with. And again, for the elderly population, and I think for those who are really physically active, as well as for adolescents, I'd go 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. I think for some populations, there's some interesting information out there, findings that would suggest maybe even a little higher, but I think that's a really good range. Consume at least 4,000 milligrams of potassium per day. Again, dark green leafy vegetables, full fat yogurt, sweet potatoes, those are real heavy hitters, and avocado is a great source. Try to get those foods into the diet as foundation foods before you start eating other foods which have very little potassium, which are most of your heavily refined and processed foods. Consume calcium-rich foods, 1,000 milligrams per day. Doesn't have to be through dairy. I mean, yogurt's a great source, but you can get ample amounts of calcium through things like almonds and dark green leafy vegetables. So it's widely distributed in whole plants. And then receive sufficient sunlight when available. And if you live in an area of this country or this world where you just don't have vitamin D available because your UVB levels are so low for 5 or 6 months in a row, and that's certainly the case where I live here, you got 2 options. You either consider moving for the winter, sometimes that's really appealing, or you take a vitamin D supplement, but it should be vitamin D3, and I think adults should start at least 2,000 IUs. I don't think 1,000 IUs is enough for most adults, and it's certainly not going to be enough for an adult with a higher BMI. 2,000 IUs is a bare minimum for an adult, in my opinion, my clinical opinion, living at a northern latitude. And that's north of, let's just say, Richmond, Virginia on the East Coast, north of Oregon on the West Coast. Again, big picture stuff here. Vitamin D, ample protein, lots of vegetables, which are rich in potassium and calcium, and then you're going to get a good balance here with that bone resorption model we've talked about. Adequate bone building processes through osteoblast activity. You're going to have some osteoclast activity because you want your bones to be remodeled. You don't want to end up with, bone spurs and all types of abnormal bone growth. So you got to have both going on, but it's that homeostasis that we're looking for. This is a great paper on that. Again, Journal Nutrients 2020, if you want to get a kind of a broad, big picture view. And in conclusion, as I mentioned earlier in this talk, a lot of questions remain regarding how much a supplement on its own, or even a couple supplements taken together, how much efficacy is there? And I'm going to share 3 with you here. Here's calcium. You can see that calcium appears to offer some modest preservation, vitamin D. Vitamin D supplementation offers some modest bone preservation, but not really any significant amount of increased bone mineral density. Maybe a small amount, but not a lot. And that's with vitamin D supplementation. And then you can look at both calcium or vitamin D in the relative risk, and you just get very, very modest risk reductions here, right? It's not improved at all. It goes up from 1 to 1.01 with vitamin D, versus controls here. Slight risk reduction over on this other side, so you're not really seeing a big return. And with calcium intake, if we look at total mineral content, which we're going to use that as a surrogate marker for bone mineralization, you can see there's nothing here. There's no relationship at all between taking calcium supplements and bone mineralization. So I don't think supplementation is the answer. I think it's about relying on whole plant-based foods, choosing plants and foods with high mineral and trace mineral contents, getting regular resistance work, whether that's through weight, band training, plyometrics. There's a lot of different ways to put stress on your bones through exercise, but it's critical in this. And then get outdoors and move in the sun if you can. I think these are really the low-hanging fruit here with respect to risk reduction for osteoporosis, repairing bones that have become, osteopenic or have lost bone minerals. I think it's it's really the approach, and then I think the supplements come in if you're, trying to, cover maybe a deficiency or, trying to get to a place of repletion. I've got a really extensive list of references here that I'd like to share with you. Read into these as you see fit. And with that, I just want to say thank you for your interest in this topic. It's one of my favorites, and it's been great being with you today. Take care.
Great, thank you, Dr. Bagnulo. This is Laura. I know we only have like 2 minutes left for questions. And a lot of you have submitted questions, and I greatly appreciate that. We will also try and answer some questions in a follow-up blog post on our website, and the webinar was recorded and should be available on our website in the next 1 to 2 weeks. You should get an email about both of those follow-up items. We have a lot of questions about vitamin K, Dr. Bagnulo, so I'm going to start with just, since we only have a few minutes. A lot of people are asking about supplemental K2, and if they're not getting enough in their diet, what is supplemental K2? Is it beneficial? Does it have the same effect on bone remodeling? And should they use like an MK4 or an MK7? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. It's one of the best questions you could ask. I think we're at a place where we're still in, for lack of a better description, we're in a place of infancy with respect to understanding vitamin K2, what is ideal physiologically. I would say that 50 micrograms, again, that's 32 micrograms is what was observed with the dietary analysis in the Rotterdam study. And I've heard from different researchers that I know in the field that 50 micrograms would be a good starting point for supplementation to try to bring up a population or from a handful of studies that have been done to get them to a place of significant difference between themselves and the average American who would come in as their cohort. I think 50 micrograms is a good starting point. I know that there are recommendations for 150 micrograms. We just don't know yet, Laura. We know that it's important. We have a handful of studies that, like the Rotterdam study, which indicate that we're not getting enough, and that having, whether it's 32 or 40 micrograms in the diet a day is protective against one or more aberrations of where minerals end up in the body. I would say start there at 50 micrograms. I think you can get that through food, but if you want to take a supplement, I don't have any empirical evidence that MK4 is better than MK7. And the good news is, if you get it from foods, you're going to get a blend of both. If someone eats egg yolks and they have yogurt and they have, let's say, some kind of fermented vegetable product, you're going to get a good blend of MK4 and MK7. And I think that's a good starting point. But I think if someone wants to take a supplement, I would start at 50 micrograms per day. I don't have evidence, outside of some unique conditions where more might be necessary. I just don't have any evidence that more than 50 micrograms per day, that there's an upside to it.
Okay, great. And is there any upper limit of vitamin K that would cause issues?
No, I have not seen any research to suggest or indicate that there's an upper ceiling for it. And not with respect to clotting, risk for premature clotting or anything like that. That's a concern that I always hear as a clinician. Am I concerned with vitamin K, vitamin K2 or vitamin K levels in someone's diet that's on a blood thinner? And the answer is, look, those blood thinners should typically be administered based on a patient's clotting time. So you get a baseline value. And that's all you have to really do as a clinician, is just get new baselines to make sure that the blood thinner being used is adequate enough in the face of maybe higher levels of dietary vitamin K2. But there's no research to date, Laura, that indicates an upper ceiling with this particular nutrient.
Okay, and last question, and like I said, y'all, I know you have a lot more questions out there, and I'll try to do my best to answer them in a blog, but you had mentioned full-fat dairy products, as a good source of vitamin K. Now, are the low-fat versions or the non-fat versions just as good, or what is limited in those items?
Yeah, well, of course, vitamin K2 is a fat-soluble vitamin, so when you eliminate the fat, you're going to eliminate some of this vitamin. So it's important that it be full fat. Now, that being said, there are small amounts that remain, because there are still small lipid contents to low fat and even skim milk products. People aren't always aware of that, but there are very small amounts found in some of your low fat, reduced fat products. But the full fat is really the best source. Now, I want to leave you with this, Laura. I know you'll find this amusing as well. The primary investigators for the Rotterdam study, if you ever get a chance to read that paper, I highly encourage any of our listeners that are intrigued by this conversation to go here. You go to the Rotterdam study, you get the full paper. It's available free through PubMed or Medline. You go there and you read the conclusions by the author. And one of the most fascinating statements in that conclusion is the authors say, although high-fat dairy products were primarily relied upon by the population here, in this case the intervention group, or whoever you want to look at it in the Rotterdam study, the population that ate the most high-fat dairy products, they had the highest levels of vitamin K2 and thereby had the lowest levels of calcified coronary arteries, lowest levels of aortic calcification, the lowest levels of cardiac events, right? So they have much lower risk for cardiovascular disease. However, the authors say it still warrants concerns because these foods, these high-fat foods, are known to be associated with cardiovascular disease. So even though in their study they observed risk reduction by eating vitamin K2 rich foods, high-fat dairy, most of it was cheese for the most part, and eggs, the authors felt compelled to say that we have to be a little more cautious around the inclusion of high-fat dairy products because of what people have thought about them over the years. So I'm leaving you with that, Laura, because it's really interesting that the authors are going to give us that in their conclusion statement, even though what they observed was very contrary to the recommendations around dietary fat over the last 30 or 40 years. So you really got to go with high-fat dairy products to get the full dose of vitamin K2. Again, the egg yolks are where the K2 is found, not the egg whites. So a lot of this does seem to be right? It seems to be contraindicated by the dietary recommendations over the last 40 years with respect to cardiovascular health.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. It takes a long time to overcome old habits and old thought processes. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bagnulo. I will be sending out everybody's continuing professional education certificate as well as the full list of the references in an email this afternoon. So please be looking out for that. If you don't receive it, sometimes they go to spam and whatnot. So let us know if you don't get it. But I will send out the certificates and the references for everyone. Thank you everybody for joining. We appreciate it. And we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week.